Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at the oldest dead white European males and other reflections on the classics by Bernard Knox. This book was published in 1993, and it's a collection of essays. The word collection is doing a lot of work, though it's really only 3 essays, and plus a foreword. The longest of those essays is The Oldest Dead White European Males, but it's not the longest by far. They're all roughly 30 plus pages. The first one, Oldest Dead White European Males, a little over 40 pages, and the others are I guess the Continuity of Greek Culture is 20 some odd, The Walls of Thebes is 30 some odd pages. And that's it. So it's a short book. The whole book is 130 pages long. All said and done. So it's pretty short. 3 essays. And I actually am not going to talk about the title essay, The Oldest Dead White European Males. That one is okay. I was kind of expecting more out of it. I was going to read some of it, but I just decided I'm not that fond of it. I don't like it as much as I was hoping I would. And the essay, The Walls of Thebes, is the one I want to focus on. That essay has a nice defense of the Sophists in it. That's not the entirety of the essay, but it's a decent portion in the center of the essay, where he talks about the Sophists and kind of sticks up for them and says they've gotten a bit of a bad rap, which I agree with. Undeserved bad reputation. So that's the part I want to focus on, and I guess I'll get right into it. Like all my episodes, I'll be reading a few sections and providing a little bit of commentary. This is section 3 of this essay, The Walls of Thebes. This essay, by the way, was first delivered in 1981. So anyhow, he says here, quote, "Rhetoric and its ancillary disciplines owed their birth in the second half of the 5th century BC to something that had happened over half a century before, the establishment in Athens of a form of government called Demokratia, literally translated, the people in power, which made the assembly of free citizens the sovereign authority in the state. It was at first a very conservative democracy. Its mainstay, the farmers of Attica, who owned armor and formed the battle line which defeated a Persian force at Marathon in 490 BC to the astonishment of both sides. When the Persians came back in force, they burned Athens to the ground. But the Athenians had taken to the sea. Their fleet played a key role in the defeat of the Persian navy at Salamis, the decisive battle of the war. Athens then used its fleet to liberate the Greek cities of the Aegean Islands and the Asian Minor coasts. It proceeded to organize them in a league which became a naval empire. And these achievements changed the nature of democracy. The revenues of empire, the safety of the state, depended now not on the farmers, who formed the infantry line, but on the urban poor who manned the war galleys. By mid-century, the new power relationships were beginning to find a political form, and curbs on full popular sovereignty were weakened or removed. The great age of Periclean imperial democracy started on its splendid, short-lived career. This new way of life and government created the need for a new education, or rather, in the sense that education is a preparation to play an active, even leading role in the community of equals, something that had never existed before. The decision by majority vote, sovereign in every aspect of daily life, from assembly decisions on peace or war to the most insignificant lawsuits brought before a jury, made the art of persuasion not only the key to success in public life, but also an essential weapon of self-defense in private and business affairs." End quote. So here you have the basics. Democracy and rhetoric were sort of born together. When democracy arose, suddenly it became important to convince people of your position. In the assembly, people would give speeches arguing for their preferred course of action. And people would vote on what they were going to do, But if you felt passionately that the people should do one thing rather than another, it was important for you to be able to effectively make your case. Likewise, their law courts would require that someone speak to defend himself, or if you were an accuser, that you speak to make your accusations. And the jury's decision of guilt or innocence was often based on the persuasiveness of the various arguments. So when power was put into the hands of the people, and even in an even more democratic manner, once that power went from sort of the wealthy landowners to more and more spreading to the urban poor as their importance in warfare increased, the urban poor would man the galleys, and the strength of Athens began to depend on them. And knowing this, they began to demand more political power, and they received it. So the democracy sort of grew and expanded to more and more people. The franchise expanded to more and more people. There were no wealth requirements, as poor people were able to participate just as much as wealthy in the assembly. And so along with this democracy, of course, came the need for people to be able to make their case. So rhetoric, the art and skill of rhetoric, arose with democracy. And I think that's pretty interesting. Moving on, he says, quote, "There had been persuasive speakers long before democracy was thought of. Odysseus is the mythical prototype of the great orator. But such skill was a gift of the gods. Either you had it or you didn't. And in a closed aristocratic society, you would not have too much need for it. Aristocratic minds tend to think alike. The young aristocrat did not need eloquence to win a place in society. It was already won. All he had to do was to measure up to the standards of his fathers, to be preeminent in battle, to bring glory on his family at the great athletic games, to play the lyre and sing the traditional songs at the symposium. But none of this was thought of as education. The aristocrat knows by instinct, by blood, he would say, the duties and privileges of his caste. It is characteristic of an aristocracy, in fact, to find education rather suspect. A man who has to learn the way things are done is by definition an outsider. The wise man is he who knows much by nature, just by being what he is, said Pindar, singing the praises of the aristocratic virtues in the century which saw them go under. As for learning, a man can learn and yet see darkly, walking always on uncertain feet, his mind unfinished, and fed with scraps of 1,000 virtues. This sorry makeshift is contrasted with the aristocratic hero par excellence, Achilles, trained by the centaur Chiron to hunt lions. The splendor running in the blood has much weight. But these words were the swan song of a dying ideal. Athenian democracy had changed the world forever. It is true that the old families still dominated Athenian politics, but they did not do so by God-given authority. The splendor running in the blood had to learn some new tricks. The statesman now had to be elected. To influence policy, he had to persuade the assembly, and at the end of his term of office, he had to account for his actions before his fellow citizens. Even if he renounced political power, he still needed the persuasive arts, for in the new Athenian law courts, as in the assembly, a man spoke for himself, not through a lawyer. And in Athens, the courts, safeguard of the new democracy, sat in continuous session. The Athenians then, as now, were a litigious lot, very apt to go to law about anything at all. There can have been few Athenians who did not sooner or later appear in court, as prosecutor or in self-defense. And here, again, though birth and wealth did no harm, persuasion was essential. "To the eye of persuasion I give all praise," said the goddess Athena in the tragedy of Aeschylus, which commemorated the foundation of Athens' oldest court of law. Persuasion was the oil which made the wheel of Athenian democracy go round. End quote. So we see here some more of the same. We also do see a view into the aristocratic view, which was that education was sort of suspect. Now, obviously, a young aristocrat didn't just know through instinct and by blood and by nature how to do all the various things, but he was taught how to do things by his family, and he sort of absorbed the skill set of the people around him. and he didn't have to do as much persuasion anyhow. He didn't have to do as much rhetoric in the aristocratic age, so that wasn't the sort of thing that he even needed to learn. So education and rhetorical education were sort of suspect, but nevertheless, in a democracy, they still found themselves having to convince people. Their aristocratic upbringing turned out to not really be enough. As democracy took hold, they had to convince people. They could be powerful individuals in Athens, but they still had to convince people, and they still had to learn these things. Moving on, he says, quote, "There were men in real life who, like Odysseus in myth, had a natural talent for persuasive speaking. Themistocles was such a man. The caliber of his eloquence can be judged by the fact that he persuaded the Athenians to use the wealth accruing from the discovery of new veins of silver on the construction of a fleet, rather than distributing the proceeds at so much per head. But there were few such born orators, and in a political climate which places so high a value on the capacity to speak persuasively, there would inevitably develop a demand for men who could teach the art. It was soon met. The teachers were the men, most of them foreigners, not Athenians, who were generally known as the Sophists. Until Plato, in the next century, made this word a term of abuse, it was the normal Greek word to describe an expert, a poet, a musician, a craftsman, anyone who is a master of a professional skill. And the Sophists, Protagoras, Gorgias, Hippias, and many another famous name, were, first and foremost, professionals in the art of persuasion. Protagoras offered to teach, for a price, and a very high one, incidentally, how to make the weaker case appear the stronger. This, of course, is the essence of the art of persuasion. It is the man with the weaker case who needs the rhetoric. But Protagoras, like the others, was more than a teacher of rhetoric, for it was not enough to teach a man debating techniques. In an expanding and inquisitive society, he needed not only methods of expression, but something to express. He needed an acquaintance with literature, with what we call political science, with anthropology, psychology, history, with all those subjects which now constitute our so-called liberal education. We have only a few fragments of the books the Sophists wrote. Later generations let them vanish, while sedulously recopying every word Plato, the Sophists' great adversary, ever wrote, and a great many he didn't. But from the fragments, from some other scattered sources, and above all from the brilliant, if slanted, dramatic recreations of the Sophists at work contained in the Platonic dialogues, we can with some confidence reconstruct the nature and range of their educational program. Rhetoric, the technique of public speaking, was of course the core, the part for which the clients paid substantial amounts of hard cash. Protagoras announced that for every statement there was a counterstatement, and he trained his students in the technique of antilogia, speech and counterspeech. The student speaks on both sides of the question, displaying his greatest ingenuity on the weaker side. Protagoras claimed to teach how to make the weaker cause appear the stronger. The Greek words could also suggest that he could make the worse cause appear the better. The Greeks were in any case a people inclined to express themselves in antitheses, and they took enthusiastically to this system of argumentation. The evidence is to be seen everywhere in 5th century literature, in balanced pairs of speeches in Thucydides, the specimen legal speeches of Antiphon, the formal debates characteristic of Euripidean tragedy. In most instances, the case is so highly developed on both sides that it is difficult to decide for one or the other, especially in the Thucydidean paired arguments, for and against a particular policy. It is no accident that Protagoras is the author of the first succinct and memorable formulation of relativism, that the individual is the measure of all things, of the existence of the existent and the non-existence of the non-existent. End quote. So here we get introduced finally to the Sophists. And as rhetoric was becoming a incredibly important skill to have, the ability to persuade people in the assembly, it became important that somebody would be able to teach people how to do this. It's a market need, and that market need was filled by the Sophists, and they charged people money to provide them with these lessons. But that shouldn't be anything that is tremendously surprising to us. All of our college professors and teachers nowadays make money. Few and far between are those who are out teaching people how to do things and not getting paid for it. Unless you're independently wealthy, you're getting paid for it, so we shouldn't hold that against them. The Sophists essentially were telling people how to make their case, and it was sort of an arms race. If one person in the assembly, if your opponents in the assembly know how to make a good case and know how to be persuasive, you'd better also know how to be persuasive. This would be an excellent time to draw your attention back to that old book I reviewed so many years ago, In Defense of Tradition by Richard Weaver, and his essay about Socrates and dialectic and rhetoric, and how rhetoric touches upon things that matter to people, and dialectic never quite, if it's done to its utmost extreme, never quite touches on reality at all. It's just a comparison of terms and definitions and logical questions that never quite comes face to face with reality. It never draws on people's loyalties. It never draws on people's beliefs about the way the world is. It doesn't touch its facts to the ground. It's not ever contingent. And societies are built upon rhetoric. Societies are built upon people having agreement about things, having some sort of fundamental agreements about something being true that doesn't necessarily depend on an argument, but perhaps depends on the feelings or the sentiments of people, and uses those loyalties and beliefs that people have about what is good and right, and draws on those to make its case. If you, like I do, think that Richard Weaver really had the right idea in that essay, you will understand how important rhetoric is and the ability to teach rhetoric. And it's certainly not just about making the weaker case the stronger. That's kind of a caricature, I think, that comes through in Plato and is made a big deal of. And people say that kind of dismantles the entire sophistic project. Rather than seeking out for what is true, it seeks out to convince people of things that are not true. And that's seen as a major flaw in sophistry. It's not concerned first and foremost with what is true. But as I've said many times, the idea that truth is our highest goal is actually a sort of mistaken way of approaching the world, because our highest goal, our most serious fundamental goal, is the long-term survival of our societies. And we can't dismantle our own societies in pursuit of truth, and we can't question everything that our society believes all the time. We can't have a scenario in which no question has ever been answered. Nothing is ever taken as settled. Everything is always up for debate. So there's an importance that rhetoric has in that it relies on us believing things. It's not always out for the truth, but it relies on us believing things, and one of the things that it relies on us believing is that we're out for our own interests and we should do what is best for us. And rhetoric relies on that. When people are arguing in the assembly about what to do, of course they're arguing about what the truth is in the assembly. They want to base their decisions on the truth, but their end goal when they're arguing in the assembly is not to uncover the truth. Their end goal in arguing in the assembly is to determine the best course of action. These are people who have decisions to make, and they can't end their discussions walking away from the question feeling that they know less than they did when they started, which is often the case in Socratic dialogues. The dialogue ends and nobody really knows what justice is. But the assembly can't work like that. They have to make decisions and they have to have truths that they already take as given in order to use them as supports for their arguments. So rhetoric and Socratic dialogue are different, and rhetoric has an important role to play that has been heavily disparaged throughout the years, unfortunately. Although Aristotle obviously takes rhetoric back up and says, rhetoric isn't quite as bad as Plato has made it out to be. But one thing Aristotle does not do is really restore the reputation of the Sophists, sadly. So anyway, continuing from there, he says, quote, "A rhetorical technique implied and instilled a philosophical viewpoint. It was not the only one. The argument from probability, designed for defense in cases for which no favorable evidence could be adduced and hostile witnesses had to be countered. Is it probable I would assault a man taller or stronger than myself?" produced a frame of mind which invoked the criterion of probability in wider fields. We see it at work in Thucydides' brilliant reconstruction of early Greek history, as well as in the frequent critiques of prophecy, and for that matter, divine myth, which we meet in Euripidean tragedy. A rhetorical tactic designed specifically for the political assembly and appeal to expediency was an argument shaped to counter invocations of justice, tradition, the sanctity of oaths, or treaties, by playing on the short-sighted idea of its own interests, held by the mass of the audience. It was the base of the highly developed intellectual theories of realpolitik, which we encounter in the Thucydidean speeches, those speeches which Hobbes so admired, and which have remained classic statements of such doctrine ever since. One last rhetorical defense, an appeal to nature as against convention, custom, and law, gave a renewed impetus to an old controversy. It also gave rise to the idea of the Superman, who refuses to be bound by convention, whom we see described by Callicles in Plato's dialogue of the Gorgias. End quote. Okay, so what we're seeing here is that the rhetoric depends on a certain values or certain ideas. There are tactics used in rhetorical persuasion, and he addresses three of them. One of them is the argument from probability. So if you were to make an argument before the assembly, or before, this was especially in law cases, you would say, well, you're being accused of attacking this other person, and you would say, well, come now, I'm a short, small person. How likely is it really that I would do such a thing when you see this person that I'm accused of attacking is 6.5 feet and built like a brick house? Why would I do that? What is the probability of me really doing that? Think about the probabilities here. This course is unlikely to be true. Although you might not know exactly what is true. You might not have any evidence to make your case. You might not, have evidence one way or the other. The audience would have to make its decision based on what is probable. And this is what's interesting is he says that these techniques of rhetorical skill were deployed elsewhere. Thucydides uses these, and we see them elsewhere. And then the second one he talks about is the appeal to expediency. And this is designed to counter arguments about what is just or what is right or what is traditional or other things. This argument says, yes, but what is really in our best interest at this moment? Is it best for us to follow this so-called course of justice that will only make us weaker? What if we think first about how this is going to turn out and what the outcome of this course of action is going to be? Is it going to benefit us? What about the benefit? What about our interests? What is going to be most in our interests? And this also comes through in the various speeches in Thucydides, as different people make the case for what we consider realpolitik, and people saying, look, I'm going to do, your argument for justice doesn't have the strength that my argument does because I'm going to do what is in my interest. The Athenians are going to do what is in the interest of the Athenians, and the other people should simply understand that that's the way the world works. And Athenians are not going to sacrifice their interests in pursuit of justice. Why would they do that? Justice is something that is of less importance in that moment because it's not in accord with their interests. And then the third rhetorical technique that also comes through elsewhere in Greek society is the appeal to nature as against convention, custom, and law. And he doesn't talk too much about this. He talks about the idea of the Superman who refuses to be bound by convention, just the idea that nature's man is going to do what it is in his nature to do. And he need not be confined by this or that custom, which is only going to hold him back. This is almost the Ayn Rand argument. Powerful people deserve to be able to exert their will. People are going to behave according to their nature. And this is not an invalid argument, because the truth is, as I've said many times, there is a nature to people. We have a human nature, and we can be expected to do certain things, and we should not try to build a society that puts too much demand on people acting against their nature, behaving in ways that are unnatural. We shouldn't necessarily fault people for doing what comes naturally to them. We should try to the best of our ability, while still having a functional civilization, to have a society that works in accord with human nature. And this is why capitalism works in many regards, because it allows people to do things in their own best interests, which is how people behave. It doesn't totally demand that they completely become selfless and give themselves over to the greater good of the society and put all of their own personal ambitions aside and only think about what's for the greater good. Of course, people do want to act in the greater good, but people also want to act in their own best interests, and that's just human nature. So these are arguments that the rhetoricians would use in attempting to make their case in the assembly or in the law courts. And those rhetorical traditions popped up elsewhere as well. So continuing from there, he says, quote, "Rhetorical training, with its philosophical and critical spin-off, was not the whole of the Sophists' program. They also discoursed and wrote on subjects which clearly identify them as the first professors of the humanities. For one thing, they all claimed to be interpreters of poetry, and to teach that skill to their pupils. My opinion," says Plato's Protagoras, "is that the most important part of a man's education is the ability to discuss poetry intelligently. The Greeks had no sacred, ethical, or religious text, no Bible. The authorities to which they customarily appealed on questions of conduct and belief were the poets, especially Hesiod and Homer. So that a discussion of poetry, though it might begin, as it does in Protagoras' case, as a literary critique, moved easily and imperceptibly into the moral and political spheres. As it does in this instance, Protagoras continues to pursue the question at issue, the teachability of virtue, but transferred, as he puts it, to poetry, in this case, a lyric poem of Simonides. There is evidently nothing unusual about this, for the method is accepted by the other sophists, Prodicus and Hippias, as well as by the opponent Socrates, who proceeds, in fact, to end this part of the discussion with some brazenly over-ingenious hermeneutics, which are clearly Plato's satirical dismissal of such an approach to ethical questions. Protagoras was noted, too, for his own original writings. He was the author of a famous book called On the Primitive State of Man, a history of human progress. Its contents and spirit are almost certainly reflected in the great ode of Sophocles' Antigone, and underlie the myth of the origin of justice put in his mouth by Plato in the dialogue which bears his name. He also wrote a book on the gods, which, to judge by the first sentence, all we have, maintained an agnostic stance. He seemed to have developed a theory that the purpose of punishing criminals should be not revenge, but their rehabilitation. And we are also told that he drew up the laws for the new Pan-Hellenic colony founded at Thurii in Italy, under Athenian leadership. The other great sophists were just as versatile. Prodicus was famous for his attempts to rationalize religious myth, and also for his careful distinction between apparent synonyms, which makes him the archetype of linguists and analytical philosophers. His method is the target of an exquisite satire in Plato's dialogue. Even Gorgias, who claimed to teach nothing but the art of persuasion, and cast scorn on those, particularly Protagoras, who made wider claims, provided a philosophical base for the amoral neutrality of his rhetoric, with a famous philosophical statement of the impossibility of true knowledge. As for Hippias, he was so versatile that, In addition to offering the usual rhetorical training, he taught, among other things, astronomy, geometry, arithmetic, grammar, mythology, and history, including the history of philosophy and mathematics. In Plato's dialogue, Protagoras dismisses such studies as too technical. For himself, he makes the extraordinary claim that his teaching will confer on his pupils sounder judgment in both private and public business, enable them to manage their family affairs in the best possible manner, and exert paramount influence, both by speech and by action, in the life of the community. "You mean," says Socrates, "that you teach the art of politics and promise to make men good citizens?" And Protagoras answers, "That is an exact definition of what I profess to offer." End quote. So here you see that rhetoric was only just a fraction of what these guys taught. They taught a whole bunch of things. They considered themselves experts in a bunch of things. Poetry was considered very important. The ability to know about the various poets and what they had to say, especially Homer and Hesiod, and be able to draw moral and political inferences from the poets. And also other things. He mentions one sophist who taught a whole great many things: arithmetic, geometry, grammar, etc. And what I also think is interesting and tragic is that Protagoras had his own books that he wrote. He wasn't just a teacher, he was an author. And he was the author of a famous book called On the Primitive State of Man. Imagine that. Back in ancient Greece, Protagoras wrote a book called On the Primitive State of Man. Of course, they really knew very little about the primitive state of man, but they must have had access to some really ancient history back then that we no longer have, which would have been... I wish we still had that book. I wish we had the books of the Sophists. He had another one called On the Gods, and I wish we had that book as well. And I think it's really sad that we don't. I'm sure that if we had just as many of the writings of Protagoras and the other Sophists as we have of Plato and Aristotle, we would probably have a very different impression of what the Sophists were all about. And certainly Western philosophy would have gone down a slightly different road if we had more to go on than just the voluminous writings of Plato and much of Aristotle's writings, not all of them, but much of them, and then not an awful lot, a few scattered writings from other people. But if we had more from the Sophists, of which we have virtually nothing, I think we would have probably a different view of what they were about. And it may be that our philosophy would have taken a different turn, and our societies would have taken a different turn. Our intellectuals would believe different things. Probably Christianity would have developed in a slightly different direction, given that much of Christianity got its ideas from Greek philosophy. So I think it's a great tragedy that we don't have those writings. But so be it. We have to go by the writings of Plato. Plato was not friendly to the Sophists, so of course we get a biased view. But it is what it is. That's what we've got. Anyway, moving on from there, he says, quote, "It is often said that the importance of Socrates in the history of Western thought is that he brought theory down from the skies, from cosmological speculation to the human world, to the moral and political problems of mankind. But this was in fact the achievement of the Sophists, who created an education designed for the first great democracy. Of course, their teaching, and still more the new, often skeptical attitudes it generated, contributed to the intellectual revolution, which in the last quarter of the 5th century BC undermined age-old religious and moral beliefs, as well as traditional political loyalties. But it is an exaggeration to place on the shoulders of the Sophists full responsibility for the breakdown of traditional morality and religion in the late 5th century. Thucydides attributes the loss of faith and religion not to the teachings of the Sophists, but to the horrors of the plague of 430 to 427 BC. And though the speeches he puts in the mouth of Cleon and Alcibiades owe their form to sophistic rhetoric, there is no reason to think that if there had been no sophists at all, the male population of Scion and Melos would have escaped with their lives. Thucydides sees the general abandonment of humane standards as the result of the teaching not of the sophists, but of the war, which is, as he says, a teacher, and a brutal teacher at that. The sophists have been saddled with more than their fair share of the blame by the genius of a comic poet, Aristophanes, and by the still greater genius of a philosopher, who, while claiming that books were deceivers, and that truth only came from the give and take of spoken dialogue, wrote books of such brilliance, with such hypnotic grace, that he has imposed his own biased view of 5th century Athens on all succeeding generations. It was Plato, of course, who made the word sophist into a term of abuse, and also, though this aspect of his work is seldom mentioned, tried to suppress the new humanities. It was perfectly logical that he should do so. They had been created to provide education and citizenship for that democracy which Plato loathed and despised, not only because it had put his master Socrates to death, but also because he saw clearly the real flaws of Athenian imperial democracy: its inability to maintain a stable policy, its encouragement of sycophancy and political corruption. He saw also as flaws what were in fact its virtues: its openness to new ideas, its freedom of speech, its establishment of equality before the law. Plato's concern for truth and denunciation of the moral neutrality of much sophistic teaching can only be praised. But in his search for a better form of education, he threw out the baby with the bathwater. In his ideal states, both the rigidly controlled nightmare of the Republic and the slightly less stifling bad dream of the laws, the basic materials of the humanities, poetry, philosophy, history, and the arts, are either expelled bag and baggage, or else forced to sing an official song to please the censors. Plato is a great artist and philosopher, but there is surely no one listening who would abandon even the most corrupt and inefficient democracy to live in his republic." End quote. So there we just get the final verdict that Plato has really ruined the reputation of the Sophists. The Sophists were not the ones who caused the moral breakdown of Athens, the fall in religious belief, the destruction of traditions, and the sort of breakdown of Athenian society, although it sometimes, I guess, gets blamed on the Sophists and their dangerous relativism, undermining everybody's belief in everything. It was really, according to Thucydides, it was the war, the Peloponnesian War, and the horrors of the plague which happened simultaneously with the war, and all of the suffering that the Athenian people went through in those circumstances. He says war is a brutal teacher, and it did much to end people's ability to have faith in the gods or adhere to higher moral callings. They just became, the war, and not just in Athens, but all across in the writings of Thucydides. It's remarkable just what the war did to people and how vicious they became to one another, and how all their ideals of justice were put aside for various people's own benefits. And so it wasn't really the Sophists, but Plato, and he criticizes Plato here a little bit, that Plato wrote about how true knowledge doesn't come from books, but from this Socratic dialogue. And yet Plato wasn't wandering the streets. I mean, Plato was a teacher, like the Sophists were, but he wasn't really engaging in the Socratic practice of hanging out in the agora, chatting with people, and calling into question everything that they believed. But he was writing books, despite the fact that in his books he criticizes he puts into Socrates' mouth the criticism of books and the skill of writing. And many people, as he closes that section, people wouldn't really want to give up having some sort of say in their society. I mean, democracy has its downsides, but it has its virtues as well. There are certain things that we like about democracy. I like having some sort of say in how things are run. I like having a vote, and most people like having a vote. But there are downsides to democracy as well, obviously, that our society tends to fail to recognize. We put democracy on a pedestal, and we don't have a really mixed system, which is, of course, the best system, having some democracy, but not too much democracy, having some aristocracy, but not too much aristocracy, having some monarchy, having a king, but not an absolute king. A mixed system is the best system, but democracy is not totally ruinous in and of itself, unless it's totally unbalanced. But the point is that most people like having some sort of democracy, and when we look at the Republic and the world that Plato proposes, we don't really want to live there. We don't really want to live in the Republic, as he describes in his book, and we don't want to live in the world described in the laws. So the point is really, did Plato really know what he was talking about? He was a gifted writer. He was a great philosopher. People will speak about Plato till the end of time, but, he may have been unfair to the Sophists, who were engaged in the world as it is, and weren't crafting these imaginary republics, weren't crafting these hypothetical scenarios that never actually saw the light of day. The Sophists were teaching people how to deal with the world as they found it, how to make their way in through life, how to be successful in their businesses, how to run their households well, how to be successful in the assembly. This is not what Plato was teaching. Plato was teaching that you would be best to withdraw from the assembly. Plato never spent time in the assembly, just like we saw in the book The Trial of Socrates. Socrates never went and spent time in the assembly arguing his cases. He spoke with people in the agora about lofty ideals, but he didn't go into the assembly and make the case for this policy or that policy, and neither did Plato. That's not what they were about. And I think there's something to be criticized there, and the Sophists, there's something I think to honor in the Sophists for their practicality, for the fact that they were Athenian citizens, or they were citizens of Greece. Granted, they were teachers and they were wanderers, but they taught people how to engage in their society, how to engage in the polis, how to try to strive for success for themselves and for their people. And there's something, I think, honorable about that. And I also think that the relativism of man being the measure of all things that is so criticized by so many people is a misunderstood doctrine. And I think that at the end of the day, man is the measure of all things, because when we hear a rational two arguments that are purporting to be rational, it's nothing but the sentiment of rationality within us, the intuitive sense of what is a self-evident first principle that can decide which rational argument stands on solid ground and which stands on quicksand. Only our inner intuition can make that case, and ultimately, when competing intuitions meet one another, it's just the art of persuasion and rhetoric that wins the day among the men who are deciding what the truth is. So with that, I'm going to wrap this up. Thanks very much for listening. I'll talk to you again next time.